Welcome to yet another one of my True Mafia story compilation videos. I've got 6 stories here for you taken from the channel, so you don't have to go browsing for anything and can get your fix with no interruptions. If you like what you hear, feel free to subscribe and join the family. Let's get started. 1986, Long Island, New York. Michael Franzese pulled into a gas station, regular unleaded, $1.18 per gallon. At the station across the street, $1.32 per gallon. Same gas, same octane, 14 cents cheaper at Franzese's station. Customers lined up around the block. Nobody asked questions. Cheap gas was cheap gas. What they didn't know, those 14 cents represented the federal and state taxes that Franzese wasn't paying. He collected the money from customers, then kept it. At his peak, Franzese operated hundreds of gas stations across New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Florida, selling millions of gallons per week, collecting taxes, never remitting a single dollar to the government. Fortune magazine called him number 18 on its list of 50 most wealthy and powerful mafia bosses in America. Vanity Fair named him one of the biggest money earners for the mafia since Al Capone. This is the story of Michael Franzese, the Colombo family capo who discovered the most profitable scam in mob history. How he made $8 million a week selling gasoline, how he partnered with the Russian mafia to build a billion-dollar empire, and how the whole operation collapsed when his partner became an FBI informant. The mob had controlled drugs, gambling, and unions for decades. But gasoline? That was Michael Franzese's invention, and it made him richer than any drug dealer. The medical student who dropped out. May 27, 1951, Brooklyn, New York. Michael Franzese was born to John Sonny Franzese, a Colombo family underboss, and Cristina Capobianco, who was only 16 when she gave birth. Sina had been a cigarette girl at the Store Club in Manhattan when Sonny got her pregnant. Sonny was already married with 3 children. To avoid scandal, Cristina married Frank Grillo. Michael grew up thinking Grillo was his biological father. At 18, Michael learned the truth. The mob allowed Sonny to divorce his first wife. Grillo disappeared. Sonny married Cristina officially. Sonny didn't want his son in the mob. He'd spent decades as an enforcer, accused of 30 to 35 murders. He knew the life ended in prison or debt. He pushed Michael toward legitimate success. Michael enrolled in a pre-med program at Hofstra University. Smart kid, good grades, a future as a doctor. Then, in 1967, when Michael was 16, federal agents arrested Sonny. Bank robbery, 50-year sentence. The family lost everything. Sonny's criminal earnings dried up. Legal fees piled up. Michael's mother couldn't afford to support him and his siblings. In 1971, Michael dropped out of Hofstra. He needed money, fast. He met his father's associates, including Joseph Colombo Sr., boss at a Colombo family crime family. They offered him work. Nothing violent at first. Collections, errands, learning the business. By 1975, at 24 years old, Michael became a made man, fully initiated into the Colombo family. His father had tried to keep him out, but Michael joined anyway, for the money, to support his family while Sonny was in prison. He'd spend the next 12 years becoming the most profitable mobster in America. The partner. 1981, Long Island. Lawrence Salvatore Urizo approached Michael Franzese with a proposition. Urizo was a Jewish businessman with connections to the gasoline industry. He owned several gas stations. He understood petroleum distribution, wholesale networks, tax structures, and he'd figured out a loophole. Here's how gasoline taxation worked in the early 1980s. Federal and state governments imposed excise taxes on gasoline, roughly 18 cents federal, plus state taxes varying by location. When a wholesale company sold gas to a retail station, the wholesale company collected taxes from the retailer. Then the wholesale company was supposed to remit the taxes to the government. But what if the wholesale company never paid? The government would eventually come after them for the missing tax revenue. But if the wholesale company only existed on paper, no assets, no employees, just a shell corporation, there'd be nothing to seize. Urizo's scheme was elegant. Set up a chain of wholesale gasoline companies. Company A sells to Company B. Company B sells to Company C. Company C sells to retail stations. When the government demands payment from Company C, the company dissolves. The owners disappear. The trail leads nowhere. Meanwhile, the people who actually control the operation had already collected millions in unpaid taxes. Urizo had been running small-scale versions of this scam, but he faced a problem. Other criminals in California were muscling in on his operation. He needed protection. That's where Michael Franzese came in. Franzese listened to the pitch. He immediately understood the potential. This wasn't like drugs or gambling, activities that were inherently illegal. Selling gasoline was legal. Collecting taxes was legal. The only illegal part was not remitting the taxes. And by the time the government figured it out, the shell companies would be gone. Franzese offered Urizo protection and mob backing. In return, Franzese would take a percentage of the profits. The partnership was formed, and the gasoline tax scam exploded. The Empire. 1981 through 1986. The operation expanded rapidly. Franzese and Urizo set up 18 stock-bearer companies based in Panama. Under Panamanian law at the time, gasoline could be sold tax-free from one wholesale company to the next. Perfect for creating layers of shell corporations. They established a network of wholesale distributors across 4 states: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Florida. The system worked like this. Step 1. Create a new shell company. Give it an official-sounding name. Register it in Panama or another jurisdiction with loose regulations. Step 2. The shell company buys gasoline from a legitimate supplier. The supplier delivers real gasoline to real storage facilities. Step 3. The shell company sells that gasoline to retail stations, legitimate gas stations that needed product. Step 4. The retail stations pay the shell company. That payment includes federal and state taxes collected from customers at the pump. The shell company collects millions in tax revenue, then vanishes, never remits a single dollar to the government. Step 6. Create a new shell company and repeat. The retail gas station owners weren't necessarily aware of the scam. They bought gasoline from a wholesaler, paid their bills. As far as they knew, the wholesaler was handling taxes properly. But Franzese's operation offered them a deal. Buy from us, and we'll sell you gasoline at below market rates. Why below market? Because Franzese wasn't paying the 18-cent per gallon federal tax or the state taxes. He could undercut every legitimate wholesaler and still make massive profits. Gas stations across the region started buying from Franzese's network. They could sell gas cheaper than competitors. Customers flooded their pumps. Revenue officials later estimated that New York State alone was losing $250 million per year in stolen gasoline taxes. Florida lost between $40 and $250 million annually. Across 4 states, the operation was stealing an estimated $1 billion in tax revenue during the 1980s. Franzese's personal take? Up to $8 million a week at the operation's peak. The Russian connection. Franzese couldn't run this operation alone. He needed partners who understood the gasoline industry, who could move product, who wouldn't attract FBI attention. He found them in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. the Russian Mafia. There in the 1970s and 80s, thousands of Russian immigrants settled in Brooklyn. Many were legitimate, but some, particularly those from the Soviet criminal underworld, brought their criminal expertise to America. Franzese partnered with Russian mobsters who controlled gasoline distribution networks. They had the infrastructure, the trucks, the storage facilities, the retail connections. Franzese provided protection and mob legitimacy. If anyone tried to muscle in on the Russians' territory, the Colombo family would handle it. In return, the Russians managed the day-to-day operations. They moved the gasoline, they handled logistics, they kept the scam running smoothly. Years later, Franzese described them. Best partners I ever had. I taught them how to defraud the government out of hundreds of millions of dollars of tax money. The partnership worked perfectly. The Russians brought business acumen, Franzese brought mob muscle and political connections. Together, they built the most profitable scheme in organized crime history. But the operation attracted attention.
The crackdown, 1984 and 85. Federal and state tax authorities noticed something wrong. Gasoline tax revenues were plummeting. Retail stations were selling millions of gallons, but the wholesale companies collecting taxes weren't remitting payments. Investigators started tracking the shell companies. They discovered the Panama registrations, the constantly changing corporate names, the non-existent addresses. They realized this was organized fraud, not isolated incidents, a systematic operation stealing hundreds of millions. The FBI opened an investigation. They identified Lawrence Iorizo as a key figure. They started surveilling him, wiretapping his phones, following the money. They also identified Michael Franzese, the Colombo capo, the one providing muscle and protection. But proving the case was difficult. The shell companies existed legally. The gasoline sales were legitimate transactions. The only crime was the unpaid taxes, and by the time investigators identified a shell company, it had already dissolved. Franzese was careful. He never personally handled the gasoline, never signed corporate documents. He stayed insulated from the day-to-day operations. But federal prosecutors had a tool that changed everything: RICO, the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, allowed them to target the entire criminal enterprise, prove a pattern of racketeering, and everyone involved could face decades in prison. They just needed someone to flip, to provide inside testimony about how the operation worked. The betrayal. 1986. Federal agents arrested Lawrence Iorizo. They didn't charge him with the gasoline tax fraud, not yet. They arrested him for an unrelated offense. But they made it clear: cooperate on the gasoline case or face decades in prison. Iorizo had a choice: stay loyal to Franzese and the Colombo family, or save himself. Franzese knew what Iorizo would choose. Franzese later said, "I predicted he would cooperate. I believed my partner was weak. I knew he would cooperate with the authorities to avoid jail time." Franzese was right. Iorizo became an FBI informant. He provided detailed testimony about the entire operation: shell companies, Panama registrations, money flows, Russian partnerships, Franzese's role. He also revealed something critical. Franzese and Iorizo had a bank account in Austria containing $33 million. The FBI seized it. December 1986, federal prosecutors indicted Michael Franzese on racketeering, tax fraud, and conspiracy charges. The evidence was overwhelming. Iorizo's testimony, financial records, wiretapped conversations, documentation of the shell companies. Franzese had three options: fight the charges and risk decades in prison, flee the country, or plead guilty and negotiate a reduced sentence. He chose the third option. Franzese pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, $14.7 million in restitution, $5 million in forfeitures. He served his time, released in 1989, rearrested in 1991 for a parole violation, finally released in 1994. He walked out of prison having served a total of about 8 years. His gasoline empire was gone. His fortune was seized, except for whatever he'd hidden in places the FBI never found. Francesi claimed he buried money in safes underground. To this day, he says authorities never located those funds.
Why it worked. The gasoline tax scheme was the most profitable mob operation since Prohibition. Why? First, it was technically legal until the final step. Selling gasoline wasn't illegal. Collecting taxes wasn't illegal. Only failing to remit taxes was criminal. That made detection difficult. Second, the profits were enormous. $8 million a week for Francesi alone. The Colombo family netted at least $80 million annually during the mid-1980s from gasoline tax frauds. Compare that to drug trafficking. Selling heroin or cocaine carried mandatory sentences. Every transaction risked arrest. Violence was constant. Informants were everywhere. Gasoline, legal product, legal transactions, clean money until the government realized it was missing. Third, scalability. Francesi operated hundreds of gas stations, millions of gallons sold weekly. The operation printed money faster than any drug network. Fourth, political insulation. Francesi laundered money through his film production company, Miami Gold. He owned car dealerships, leasing companies, auto repair shops, restaurants, nightclubs. He looked like a legitimate businessman. When investigators came around, Francesi could point to his legal businesses and claim that's where his wealth originated. And fifth, the Russian partnership. The Russians brought expertise. They managed logistics, they took risks Francesi wouldn't take himself. When authorities cracked down, many Russian partners were prosecuted. Francesi stayed insulated. Until Iorizzo flipped. The aftermath. After Francesi went to prison, the gasoline tax scam continued, but not for long. The Colombo family tried to maintain the operation. Vic Arena Jr., son of acting boss Vic Arena, took over as the family's point man for gasoline operations. The Russians continued running their networks. They paid tribute to the Colombo family, 1.5 to 3 cents per gallon sold. But federal and state authorities had learned how the scam worked. They closed the legal loopholes, they cracked down on shell companies, they prosecuted Russian and Italian mobsters involved in tax fraud. By 1993, the gasoline tax scam was finished. Estimates vary on total stolen taxes. Some say $600 million, others over $1 billion. Revenue officials will never know the exact number. Too many shell companies, too many cash transactions, too many years of fraud. What's certain? Michael Francesi made more money than almost any mobster in American history. Without selling a single gram of cocaine, without running a single gambling operation, without controlling a single union. He sold gasoline and kept the taxes. Michael Francesi is 73 years old now. He left the mob in 1995 after his release from prison. He became a born-again Christian, moved to California with his wife and 7 children. Today, he's a motivational speaker. He travels the country speaking in prisons, schools, and churches. He's written 7 books about his mob experiences. He's one of the few high-ranking mobsters who walked away from the life and survived. Most who try end up dead. But Francesi negotiated his exit, paid his debts, stayed quiet about certain things. And he occasionally tells the story of the gasoline tax scam, the most profitable criminal operation since Al Capone's bootlegged empire. The scheme that made him $8 million per week, that stole over $1 billion from federal and state governments,
that proved white-collar crime could be more profitable than drugs, gambling, or murder for hire. Fortune magazine listed him as number 18 on the most powerful mob bosses list. But by profit per year, Franzese was likely number 1 during the mid-1980s. All from selling gasoline. The mob had spent decades trafficking heroin, cocaine, marijuana. They'd risked life in prison for drug money. They killed rivals over territory. They'd faced mandatory sentences and 3 strikes laws. Michael Franzese proved there was a better way. White-collar crime, tax fraud, exploiting legal loopholes. Sell a legal product, collect the legal tax, just don't pay it. By the time the government figured it out, he'd made hundreds of millions of dollars. And when they finally caught him, he served their years, far less than drug dealers received for far smaller operations. That's why the gasoline tax scheme changed organized crime. It showed that the biggest money wasn't in drugs or violence, it was in exploiting the system, finding legal gray areas, operating businesses that look legitimate until you examine the books. The Russian Mafia learned that lesson. After Franzese taught them the gasoline scam, they moved into Medicare fraud, healthcare billing scams, insurance fraud, all white-collar crimes that generate millions with minimal violence. The old mob, the Prohibition-era gangsters, used violence and intimidation. The new mob, the one Franzese helped create, uses shell corporations and offshore bank accounts. And it's far more profitable.
September 1952. Lido Beach, Long Island. FBI agents had been searching for Tommy Lucchese for 10 days. They needed him to testify before the New York State Crime Commission. But Lucchese had disappeared. Finally, through his attorney acting as intermediary, Lucchese agreed to appear. When he walked into the hearing room, he looked nothing like a gangster. 5 feet 4 inches tall, slight build, well-tailored suit, soft-spoken, polite. He told the commissioners he was a legitimate businessman. I make $100,000 a year with my dress factories. I got 1,500 people working for me. I give them all the fringe benefits, plus turkeys twice a year. If a girl has a baby, I give her a carriage of $50. If it's twins, the parents get a car. Triplets, I build them a house. It sounded generous, charitable, the work of an upstanding entrepreneur. The FBI knew better. Because Tommy Lucchese didn't just run dress companies. He controlled Manhattan's entire garment district, not through legitimate competition, but through murder, extortion, and union corruption. This is the story of Tommy Three Finger Brown Lucchese, how he built the criminal empire behind legitimate businesses, how he became one of the 5 most powerful mob bosses in New York while convincing politicians, judges, and businessmen he was just a dress manufacturer, and how the FBI spent decades trying to prove what everyone suspected but nobody could document until his own words and connections exposed the truth. The kid who lost 2 fingers. December 1st, 1999. Palermo, Sicily. Gaetano Lucchese was born to Baldassare and Francesca Lucchese, working-class immigrants who dreamed of better opportunities in America. In early 1911, when Gaetano was 11 years old, the family emigrated to the United States. They settled in East Harlem, Manhattan's Italian neighborhood. First, at 213 East 106th Street, then 316 East 118th Street. His father worked hauling cement, hard physical labor, low pay. Young Gaetano, who would later Americanize his name to Thomas, wanted something different. As a teenager, he got a job in a machine shop. 1915. He was 15 years old when an industrial accident changed his life. The machine severed his right thumb and index finger. The injury ended his factory work, but it gave him something else, a nickname that would follow him forever.
Years later, when police arrested him for the first time, a booking officer noticed his deformed hand. The officer compared it to Mordecai Three-Finger Brown, a famous Major League Baseball pitcher who also had a deformed hand. "Three-Finger Brown," the cop said. "That's what we'll call ya." Lucchese hated the nickname. Years later, testifying before the crime commission, he said, "I'd spit in the face of any man who called me that to my face." But the press loved it, and Three-Finger Brown stuck. After losing his fingers, Lucchese spent more time on the streets. He joined the 107th Street Gang, a crew of young Italian immigrants who stole wallets, burglarized stores, and ran protection rackets. The gang operated under the protection of Tom Rayner, a Bronx-based Mafia boss. Lucchese learned the business, how rackets worked, how to collect money, how violence kept people in line. By age 18, Lucchese started his first legitimate business, a window washing company in East Harlem. The business model was simple. Anyone who refused to use Lucchese's window washing services would have their windows broken. This was Lucchese's introduction to what would become his specialty, using legitimate businesses as fronts for extortion and racketeering.
The only conviction, 1920, Riverhead, Long Island. Police arrested Lucchese for stealing a car, grand larceny. January 1921, he was convicted. March 27, 1922, he was sentenced to 3 years and 9 months in Sing Sing prison. Lucchese served 13 months. Model prisoner. Paroled early. It would be his only conviction, ever. Over the mixed 45 years, Lucchese was arrested 5 more times. Murder charges, theft, possession of stolen goods, homicide again. 0 convictions. When he was released from Sing Sing in 1923, Prohibition was in full swing. His old friends, Charlie Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, had partnered with Arnold Rothstein to sell bootleg alcohol. Lucchese joined them. During the 1920s and early 30s, Lucchese rose through the ranks of Tom Rayner's organization. He became a strong ally of Luciano. He participated in a Castelli-Marese War, the bloody power struggle that reshaped New York's Mafia families. When the war ended in 1931, Luciano organized the 5-family system. Tom Gagliano, who'd taken over after Rayner's murder, became boss of 1 family. Lucchese became his underboss. For the next 20 years, Lucchese would be second in command, learning, planning, building the empire he'd one day control. The Garment District racket. 1933. Prohibition ended. The mob needed new revenue. Lucchese founded in Manhattan's Garment District, the blocks around 7th Avenue and West 37th Street, where hundreds of clothing manufacturers operated. Lucchese formed an alliance with Louis Lepke Buchhalter, the mob boss who controlled Murder Inc., the enforcement arm that carried out contract killings for organized crime. Together, they took over the garment industry. Here's how it worked. First, they infiltrated the unions, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the Teamsters locals that controlled trucking, the cement and concrete workers who handled deliveries. Lucchese and Buchhalter placed their own people in leadership positions, union officials who answered to the mob, not the workers. Second, they controlled the trucking. If a garment manufacturer wanted to ship their products, they used mob-connected trucking companies. If they refused, the Teamsters would strike, production would stop, the manufacturer would lose contracts. Third, they offered knockdown loans, high-interest loans to cash-strapped manufacturers who couldn't get legitimate bank financing. The interest rates were usurious. If the manufacturer couldn't pay, the mob took over the business. Fourth, they provided protection. Pay a percentage of your profits, and the mob ensures your workers don't strike, your shipments arrive on time, and your competitors don't undercut you.
The garment district generated tens of millions in annual revenue, and Lucchese controlled a huge piece of it. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, Lucchese had ownership interests in more than a dozen garment shops across New York and Pennsylvania. These weren't fronts. They were actual operating businesses, but they also served as legitimate cover for income tax purposes. Lucchese could show the IRS his dress company profits and claim that's where his wealth came from. The FBI knew he was running rackets, but proving it was difficult when he owned real businesses making real money.
The legitimate facade. By the 1940s, Tommy Lucchese looked like a success story. He lived in Queens, then moved to a ranch-style home at 74 Royat Street in Lido Beach, Long Island. Nice house, respectable neighborhood, nothing ostentatious. His daughter Frances attended Vassar College. His son joined the Air Force after attending West Point. Lucchese attended charity dinners. He bought blocks of tickets to events like the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick Dinner and the Alfred E. Smith Memorial Fund. Judges, politicians, and businessmen considered him a friend. One federal judge later said Lucchese had impressed him as an agreeable little man who rarely said anything. Mayor Impellitteri of New York was among Lucchese's supporters. So was Thomas Murphy, who would become New York City's police commissioner. Lucchese had connections to Armand Chankalian, administrative assistant to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Think about that. The top federal law enforcement office in Manhattan had an assistant who was personal friends with a mafia boss. Chankalian later testified he didn't realize Lucchese had a criminal past until 1950. Then he claimed he told Lucchese, "I introduced you to some very nice people, and I owe an obligation to them. I'm sorry, I can't see you anymore." But investigators found Chankalian's car parked in front of Lucchese's house multiple times after that supposed break. Chankalian claimed he didn't recall why he'd been there. Lucchese's political connections were his greatest asset. They gave him legitimacy, protected him from prosecution, allowed him to operate his rackets while maintaining the facade of a respectable businessman. In 1943, those connections paid off. Lucchese became a naturalized American citizen. He also obtained a certificate of good conduct that expunged his arrest record from 20 years earlier. On paper, Tommy Lucchese was clean. The boss. 1951 or 1952, Tom Gagliano died of natural causes. The exact date is disputed. Some sources say 1951, others 1953. But during the 1952 questioning, Lucchese referred to Gagliano as deceased, which suggests 1951 or early 1952. Lucchese had been underboss for 22 years. He was the obvious successor. The family took his name, the Lucchese crime family. As boss, Lucchese concentrated on core Cosa Nostra values, making money, keeping a low profile, avoiding prosecution. He expanded operations beyond the garment district. He controlled rackets at Idlewild Airport, later renamed Kennedy Airport, trucking monopolies, warehouse theft, hijacking, drug trafficking networks with Sanpa Trafficante Jr. in Tampa. He appointed Stefano LaSalle as underboss and Vincenzo Rao as consigliere. In 1953, Lucchese's daughter Frances married Thomas Gambino, oldest son of Carlo Gambino, who was then underboss of what would become the Gambino family. Over 1,000 guests attended the wedding. It was a who's who of American organized crime. Carlo Gambino gave Lucchese a $30,000 wedding gift. In return, Lucchese gave Gambino a share of his airport rackets. The marriage created an alliance between two of New York's 5 families, an alliance that would dominate the commission for the next 15 years. A Treasury agent of that era wrote, "Gaetano Lucchese has become as dangerous a character, if not more so, than Costello in his heyday."
After Frank Costello's embarrassing appearance before the Kefauver Committee destroyed his political connections, Lucchese replaced him as the mob's primary political fixer. Kefauver Committee Counsel Rudolph Halley said, "Nationally, I'd say that Lucchese is the big boss." But Lucchese still maintained his dress company cover.
The Crime Commission, September 1952. The New York State Crime Commission began hearings on organized crime. They wanted Tommy Lucchese to testify. For 10 days, Lucchese avoided them. He knew testifying would expose his connections, force him to take the Fifth Amendment, put his legitimate facade at risk. But eventually, through his attorney, he agreed to appear. When questioned, Lucchese stuck to his story. He was a dress manufacturer, nothing more. "I make $100,000 a year with my dress factories," he told the commissioners. "I got 1,500 people working for me. I give them all the fringe benefits, plus turkeys twice a year." He described his generous employee benefits: baby carriages for new mothers, cars for parents of twins, houses for parents of triplets. It sounded absurd, over the top. Nobody believed it. But that was the point. Lucchese was daring them to prove otherwise. The hearings unearthed his connections to sitting politicians, to the U.S. Attorney's Office, to a future police commissioner. Time magazine ran an article titled "The Rise of Three Finger Brown." The article noted that, until last week, many New Yorkers had never heard of Tommy Lucchese, describing him as someone who appeared to be merely a prosperous, well-tailored manufacturer of ladies' coats and dresses. The magazine detailed his criminal associations: Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Trigger Mike Coppola. The article exposed what investigators had known for years. The dress manufacturer was actually a Mafia boss. The publicity destroyed his carefully constructed facade. The denaturalization attempt. November 17, 1952, days after the Crime Commission hearings ended. U.S. Attorney General James McGranery filed a complaint to denaturalize Lucchese, strip him of his American citizenship. The government's claim? Lucchese lied on his naturalization application. He didn't reveal his entire arrest record. He deliberately left out homicide charges. He used multiple aliases that he failed to disclose. If the government succeeded, they could deport him back to Italy. The case dragged on for years. Lucchese's lawyers filed motion after motion, challenging the government's procedures. April 8, 1958, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the denaturalization order on a technicality. The government had failed to properly file required affidavits when initiating the case. Lucchese won, but the government wasn't finished. The next day, April 9, 1958, U.S. Attorney General William Rogers filed a new denaturalization case against Lucchese. This time, the government got the paperwork right. The case proceeded, but Lucchese's lawyers continued fighting. Appeals, delays, legal maneuvering. The government never succeeded. Lucchese was never denaturalized, never deported. He died an American citizen. The proof they couldn't get. The FBI investigated Lucchese for decades. They knew he was running criminal operations. They documented his connections to other mob bosses. They tracked his rackets in the garment district, airports, and unions. But they couldn't prove it in court. Why? Because Lucchese actually owned legitimate businesses. His dress companies were real. They employed real workers. They generated real revenue. They paid taxes. Yes, those businesses also served as fronts for extortion and racketeering. Yes, Lucchese used them to launder criminal proceeds. Yes, the union control and trucking monopolies were illegal. But separating the legitimate business from the criminal activity was nearly impossible. When prosecutors accused Lucchese of extortion, he could point to his dress factories and say,
I'm a businessman. I own these companies. I make legitimate money. When the IRS investigated his income, he had tax returns showing earnings from Monica Modes Inc. and other garment businesses. His lifestyle matched his declared income. Nice house, but not excessive. No yachts, no mansions, nothing obviously criminal. And Lucchese was careful. He didn't personally commit murders. He didn't personally collect extortion money. He didn't personally shake down business owners. He had people for that. The FBI also faced another problem. Witnesses wouldn't talk. Garment district business owners were terrified of retaliation. Union members know what happened to people who cooperated with authorities. Lucchese's own organization was tight-knit and loyal. And Lucchese's political connections protected him. Prosecutors who got too aggressive found themselves transferred. Investigations stalled. Cases fell apart. In the early 1960s, the federal government tried one more time, tax evasion charges. They'd gotten Al Capone that way in 1931. Maybe they could get Lucchese the same way. But Lucchese's health deteriorated before the case could proceed. The end. 1967. Tommy Lucchese was 67 years old. He'd been suffering from heart disease for years. Then, doctors discovered a brain tumor. He underwent surgery, but he never fully recovered. July 13, 1967, Lucchese died at his Long Island estate, in his own bed, surrounded by family. His funeral at Calvary Cemetery in Queens drew over 1,000 mourners, judges, politicians, businessmen, and hundreds of mobsters from across the country. The FBI photographed everyone who attended. They knew the funeral would be a reunion of organized crime leadership. They documented every face, hoping to build future cases. But for Tommy Lucchese, it was over. He'd run one of the New York's 5 families for 16 years as boss, 22 years as underboss before that, 38 years at the top of organized crime. He'd controlled the garment district for over 30 years, made tens of millions of dollars, influenced mayors, judges, and federal officials. And despite being arrested 6 times, including twice for homicide, he'd only been convicted once. Auto theft in 1921, served 13 months. In 46 years of criminal activity after his release from Sing Sing, Tommy Lucchese never spent another day in prison. He died a free man, a naturalized American citizen, officially a dress manufacturer.
Why the facade worked. Tommy Lucchese succeeded where flashier bosses failed because he understood a simple truth. Legitimacy is the best disguise. Sam Giancana dated Phyllis McGuire and hung out at nightclubs. The FBI followed him everywhere. John Gotti wore expensive suits and held court at the Ravenite Social Club. He was convicted and died in prison. Lucchese ran dress factories, lived quietly on Long Island, acted like a boring businessman. Nobody wants to believe a 5'4" dress manufacturer is a dangerous mafia boss. It doesn't fit the image, and that's exactly why it worked. Lucchese's legitimate businesses weren't just fronts, they were functional enterprises that generated real income. That made them perfect cover. The IRS couldn't prove his wealth was criminal when he had tax returns showing business profits. His political connections provided protection. When prosecutors got too aggressive, Lucchese's friends in government applied pressure. Cases stalled. Investigations went nowhere. His low profile kept him out of the headlines. While other bosses drew attention, Lucchese stayed quiet. No flashy lifestyle, no public confrontations, no mistakes. And his patience paid off. Lucchese never made impulsive decisions. He thought long-term. He built systems that would outlast any individual prosecution.
The FBI spent decades investigating him. They know he was guilty. They documented his crimes. They built files. But they never got him.
In 1952, when Tommy Lucchese sat before the Crime Commission, he told them, "I make $100,000 a year with my dress factories." It was technically true. He did own dress factories. They did make money. What he didn't mention, those factories were built on union corruption, extortion, and decades of racketeering. The trucking companies that delivered fabric were mob-controlled. The unions that supplied workers answered to him. The loans that financed competitors came with interest rates that destroyed them. The dress company was real, but it was also a front, and the FBI knew it. They investigated for decades. They exposed his connections. They filed denaturalization cases. They pursued tax charges. They never made it stick. When Lucchese died in 1967, the New York Times obituary described him as the reputed head of one of New York's 5 Mafia families. Reputed, not proven. That word, reputed, defined Lucchese's entire career. Everyone knew what he was. Nobody could prove it in court. He built an empire behind dress companies and legitimate businesses. He controlled one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America while maintaining the facade of a respectable entrepreneur. And he died having never served significant prison time. The FBI realized long ago that Tommy Lucchese's dress company was a front. But realizing it and proving it were two different things. Lucchese understood that, and he used America's legal system, the presumption of innocence, the requirement of proof beyond reasonable doubt, the right to competent legal defense, to protect himself for 46 years. The dress manufacturer was a mafia boss, but on paper, he was just a businessman. And in America, that was enough. February 14, 1969, Springfield, Missouri. Vito Genovese, boss of the most powerful crime family in New York, died in his prison cell. Heart attack, age 71. He'd been in prison since 1959, convicted of narcotics trafficking, sentenced to 15 years. The FBI considered it a victory. The boss was dead. His family would weaken, maybe collapse entirely. They were wrong, because while Vito Genovese ran the family from prison until his death, someone else had been quietly building power on the outside. Vincent the Chin Gigante, a former boxer and failed hitman who would become the most successful mob boss in modern American history. This is the story of how the Genovese family appeared finished in the early 1970s, their boss dead, their organization in chaos, federal prosecutors targeting them with the new RICO Act, and how they not only survived, but became the most powerful, most disciplined, most untouchable crime family America had ever seen. Until December 2001, when the FBI finally admitted what organized crime investigators had known for years. The Genovese family wasn't just alive, they were running New York. The death and the chaos. When Vito Genovese died in 1969, the family entered a period of uncertainty. Genovese had ruled from prison for a decade. He'd ordered murders, settled disputes, approved major decisions, all from behind bars. His death left a power vacuum. The family had a ruling panel, a group of high-level members Genovese had created to supervise operations while he was imprisoned. But a committee isn't a boss. Someone had to take control. Philip Benny Squint Lombardo became the new official boss. He'd been acting boss since 1962 when Genovese was imprisoned. Now the role was permanent. But the early 1970s brought chaos. Tommy Ryan, had been front boss, the public face, while Genovese pulled strings. In 1972, Eboli was murdered.
shot multiple times in the head and neck while leaving his girlfriend's apartment in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. The killing sparked speculation about internal power struggles. Who ordered it? Was Lombardo consolidating control, or were other families making moves? The Genovese family appeared vulnerable, and federal law enforcement thought they finally had the tools to finish them off. The RICO weapon. 1970. President Nixon signed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, into law. RICO revolutionized how prosecutors could target organized crime. Instead of charging individual crimes, they could charge entire criminal enterprises. Prove a pattern of racketeering, and you could take down an entire family at once. The FBI believed RICO would destroy the Mafia. Other families felt the impact immediately. The Bonanno family was decimated by prosecutions. The Colombo family descended into civil war. The Gambino and Lucchese families faced major RICO cases through the 1980s. But the Genovese family seemed different. They kept operating quietly, carefully, without drawing the attention that destroyed their rivals. By the early 1980s, federal investigators realized something. The Genovese family they thought was weakened after Vito's death had actually grown stronger, much stronger.
The front boss strategy. 1981. Vincent Gigante became boss of the Genovese family. Philip Lombardo had officially led the family since 1969, but in 1981, at age 73, Lombardo retired. He'd served 12 years as boss, a rare accomplishment in the RICO era, and walked away a free man. Gigante took over and immediately implemented a strategy that would keep him in power for 24 years. He appointed Anthony Fat Tony Salerno as front boss. Salerno was perfect for the role. He was visible, accessible, recognizable. He wore expensive suits and fedoras. He smoked cigars. He held court at the Palmer Boys Social Club in East Harlem. He looked like a mob boss. The FBI surveilled Salerno constantly. They bugged his social club. They followed him everywhere. They assumed he was running the Genovese family. They were wrong. Salerno was a figurehead. He had real power. He was a capital. He controlled rackets. He earned millions. But he wasn't the boss. Gigante was. And Gigante operated completely differently than any mob boss before him. The Odd Father. Vincent Gigante had been a mobster since the 1950s. Born March 29, 1928 in New York. One of 5 brothers. 3 of them, Mario, Pasquale, and Ralph, joined the Mafia with him. Only Louis stayed out, becoming a Catholic priest instead. As a teenager, Gigante became a professional boxer. He fought in 25 matches between 1944 and 1947, winning 21. His mother called him Vincenzo, but her heavy Italian accent made it sound like Chin. The nickname stuck. Vito Genovese became his mentor. Gigante did anything asked of him. Between ages 17 and 25, he was arrested 7 times, possessing stolen goods, possessing unlicensed handguns, illegal gambling. In 1957, Genovese ordered Gigante to kill Frank Costello, the boss Genovese wanted to replace. May 2, 1957, Gigante shot Costello in the head outside his apartment building. The bullet only grazed Costello's scalp. He survived. A doorman identified Gigante as the shooter, but when prosecutors brought Costello to testify, Costello claimed he couldn't identify his attacker. Gigante was acquitted. 2 years later, Gigante was convicted with Vito Genovese of heroin trafficking.
He got 7 years in prison. He served 5. After his release, Gigante was promoted to captain. He ran the Greenwich Village crew, headquartered at the Triangle Civic Improvement Association. And he started acting crazy. At first, it seemed minor, muttering to himself, looking disheveled. But through the 1960s and 1970s, the act became more elaborate. Gigante wandered Greenwich Village in a robe and pajamas, unshaven, hair uncombed. He talked to himself. He urinated in public. Once, when he spotted law enforcement, he walked across the street, knelt on the sidewalk, and appeared to pray before a statue. He admitted himself to psychiatric hospitals. Between 1969 and 1983, he checked himself into St. Vincent's 22 times. Always briefly, a few days, maybe a week. Just enough to build a documented psychiatric history. His goal was simple. If he was ever indicted, he could claim incompetence to stand trial. The psychiatric records would support it. The strategy worked for decades. The real power structure. While Gigante pretended to be insane, he ran the most sophisticated criminal organization in America. He took extreme precautions against surveillance. First, he never left his home unoccupied. He knew FBI agents would sneak in and plant bugs, so someone was always there. Second, he avoided phones. When he absolutely had to use one, he'd whistle into the receiver or speak so softly it was barely audible. Third, the Genovese family members were forbidden from saying Gigante's name, ever, on phones, in meetings, anywhere. Instead, they pointed to their chins or made the letter C with their fingers when referring to him. Fourth, he held meetings while walking. Movement made surveillance difficult. No bugs could capture conversations on the street. Fifth, he used intermediaries for everything. He never personally ordered crimes. Messages went through multiple people before reaching their targets. The FBI tried everything. They bugged social clubs. They followed his associates. They wiretapped phones. They captured very little. Meanwhile, Gigante expanded the family's operations. He controlled construction and union rackets across New York. The Javits Convention Center, built in the late 1980s, became a hiring hall for mobsters and convicted felons. 35% of carpenters who worked there were convicted felons. From 1978 to 1990, the Genovese family rigged bids for 75% of window contracts awarded by the New York City Housing Authority. $142 million worth of contracts. He dominated the Fulton fish market through extortion and labor control, the waterfront, garbage hauling, loan sharking rings, bookmaking operations. He had influence in the Feast of San Gennaro in Little Italy, running gambling games, extorting vendors, pocketing church donations. At his peak, Gigante controlled an empire of close to 300 made men. His influence extended from New York's Little Italy to Miami's docks to Philadelphia's streets. He made the Genovese family the most powerful in America. The Commission leadership. After the Commission trial in 1986 destroyed the leadership of the other 4 families, Gigante became the de facto boss of the New York Mafia. John Gotti had taken over the Gambino family by murdering Paul Castellano, a violation of Commission rules. Gotti didn't get approval first. That angered Gigante. Gigante hated flashy mobsters. Gotti wore expensive suits. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club. He courted media attention. Everything Gigante despised. Gigante put a contract on Gotti. April 13, 1986, a bomb exploded under Gambino underboss Frank DeCicco's car. DeCicco died instantly. Gotti, the intended target, had changed plans at the last minute. The hit failed, but it sent a message. Gigante was in charge now. After Gotti was convicted in 1992, Gigante became what some called the Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, a title that had been abolished in 1931 but now applied to Gigante in everything but name. He coordinated activities between families. He settled major disputes. He approved significant decisions. And the FBI still thought Fat Tony Salerno was the real boss.
The FBI finally understands. February 6, 1985, FBI wiretap at the Palmer Boys Social Club. Fat Tony Salerno and a Genovese captain named Sabato were discussing the upcoming federal indictments. The commission trial was about to hit. Sabato said if they get Chin, they're wrapped up. He referred to all the finagling and manipulating to fool the government. Salerno responded, if he gets pinched, all them years he spent in that asylum would be for nothing. The FBI agents listening realized Gigante was the real boss. Salerno was just the front, but proving it would take another 12 years. January 19, 1984, another wiretap caught Salerno and Sabato discussing Gigante's power. Salerno asked about another mobster. What the hell move could he make without Chin? Sabato replied, Chin would kill him right away and he knows it. Then, nobody knows more about this thing than Chin does. The FBI finally understood every investigation that focused on Salerno was wasted effort. The real boss was the crazy man in the bathrobe wandering Greenwich Village. But Gigante's insanity defense was documented. 22 psychiatric hospital visits, doctors' reports, witnessed incidents of bizarre behavior. Proving he was faking it would be nearly impossible. The trial, January 1990. Gigante was indicted on 41 counts of racketeering and conspiracy to murder. He immediately claimed incompetence to stand trial, too mentally ill to participate in his own defense. The case stalled for years. Psychiatric evaluation after psychiatric evaluation. Doctors disagreed about his competence. Some believed he was genuinely mentally ill. Others suspected he was faking. Meanwhile, witnesses started breaking omerta. Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gambino underboss, testified against Gotti in 1992. He also testified about Gigante's activities. Phil Leone, Philadelphia underboss, became a government witness. He testified that during the 1980s, Gigante ordered several murders of Philadelphia associates. Other witnesses came forward, associates, former family members, people who'd seen Gigante operate normally when law enforcement wasn't watching. They described how Gigante had a wife and 5 children in a suburban home, but he also kept a longtime mistress on the Upper East Side. Late at night, when surveillance wasn't watching, he'd visit her, fully dressed, lucid, normal. The crazy act was exactly that, an act. Finally, in 1996, Judge Eugene Nickerson ruled Gigante competent to stand trial. The trial began, and the evidence was overwhelming. Wiretaps, testimony, financial records showing the construction rackets, union control, extortion schemes. July 1997, the jury convicted Gigante of racketeering and conspiracy to murder. December 1997, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison and fined $1,250,000. U.S. Attorney Jack Ricarda said the lengths that Vincent Gigante was willing to go to conceal his leadership of the Genovese family speaks volumes about his importance as their leader. His loss will be a devastating blow to the family and to organized crime in general. Carter was wrong about the devastating blow.
The family survives. Even with Gigante in prison, the Genovese family remained powerful. Acting bosses took over. Dominic, Quiet Dom Cirillo, ran things until he suffered a heart attack in 1998. Matthew, Matty the Horse, Aniello stepped in next. The family maintained its core operations: Fulton Fish Market, waterfront control, construction rackets, gambling, loan sharking. In 2003, Gigante admitted in court that he'd faked mental illness for decades. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice. He received an additional 3 years. December 19, 2005, Vincent Gigante died in prison. Heart attack, age 77. He'd been boss from 1981 to 2005, 24 years, longer than any other modern mob boss except for Joseph Bonanno. After his death, Liborio Barney Bellomo took over as boss, and the family kept operating. Why they succeeded. December 2001, the FBI issued a report describing the Genovese family as the largest and most powerful of the 5 families. This wasn't during Vito Genovese's reign in the 1950s. This wasn't during Lucky Luciano's era. This was 2001. 32 years after Vito Genovese died in prison. 31 years since RICO became law. While every other New York family had been decimated by prosecutions, informants, and internal wars, the Genovese family thrived. Why? First, omerta. The code of silence actually worked for the Genovese family. While hundreds of mobsters from other families turned informant through the 1980s and 90s, the Genovese family had only 11 members and associates ever turn state evidence in its entire history. 11 total, ever. Compare that to the Gambino family, where Sammy Gravano's testimony alone helped convict dozens, or the Bonanno family, where Joe Pistone's undercover operation destroyed an entire generation of leadership. The Genovese family's discipline was unprecedented. Second, the front boss strategy. By making Fat Tony Solano the visible leader, Gigante protected himself from surveillance and prosecution. The FBI spent years investigating the wrong man. By the time they figured it out, Gigante had consolidated power so thoroughly that removing him barely weakened the family. Third, Gigante's security measures. No phones, no names spoken, meetings while walking, never leaving home unoccupied. These precautions made electronic surveillance nearly useless. Fourth, patience. Gigante spent 30 years building his insanity defense before he became boss. He checked into psychiatric hospitals 22 times. He wandered streets in bathrobes for decades. That level of commitment and long-term planning was extraordinary. Fifth, avoiding attention. While Gotti courted media, Gigante avoided it. While other bosses lived flashy lifestyles, Gigante appeared to be a mentally ill man wandering Greenwich Village. The FBI focused resources on visible threats. The Genovese family operated quietly. Detective Joseph Corfey of the New York Organized Crime Task Force called the Genovese family the Ivy League of the Underworld in April 1998. That reputation was earned.
When Vito Genovese died in 1969, the FBI thought the family would weaken, maybe collapse. When the RICO Act passed in 1970, prosecutors believed organized crime's days were numbered. When other families fell apart through the 1980s, informants, prosecutions, internal wars, investigators assumed the Genovese family would follow. They were wrong every time. Because while the Genovese family appeared vulnerable, they were actually implementing the most sophisticated criminal operation in American history. Vincent Gigante's 24-year reign as boss, longer than Vito Genovese, longer than Frank Costello, longer than any modern mob leader, proved that with enough discipline, enough patience, enough careful planning, organized crime could still succeed in the RICO era. The FBI finally admitted it in December 2001. The Genovese family was the largest and most powerful of the 5 families.
32 years after their boss died in prison, they were stronger than ever. That's what made the Genovese family different. Not their violence, not their territory, not their money, their discipline. They followed on murder when everyone else broke it. They operated quietly when others sought attention. They planned for decades when others acted impulsively. And when federal prosecutors thought they destroyed organized crime, the Genovese family was still there, still operating, still powerful. The Ivy League of the Underworld.
January 1st, 1959, Havana, Cuba. Santo Trafficante Jr. stood in a Sanssouci cabaret, his flagship casino, watching chaos unfold outside. Revolutionaries poured into the streets, celebrating, chanting, smashing swap machines, throwing gambling equipment into the gutter. Fulgencio Batista had fled hours earlier. Fidel Castro was marching toward Havana from the mountains, and Castro had promised to close the casinos. Trafficante thought Castro was bluffing. The casinos generated millions in revenue. They employed thousands of Cubans. The government needed that money. He was wrong. 6 months later, Castro imprisoned Trafficante in the Tresconia detention facility, then deported him back to the United States. This is the story of Santo Trafficante Jr., the Tampa mob boss who appeared to be a legitimate cigar factory owner. How his father built connections to Cuba starting in the 1940s. How Santo Jr. became one of the most powerful casino operators in Havana under Batista's corrupt regime. And how the FBI finally realized the quiet Tampa businessman wasn't just selling cigars. He controlled Cuba's entire gambling empire and ran drug trafficking networks from South America through Havana to the United States, until Castro destroyed it all in a single night. The Cigar City Boss. 1886, Sicily. Santo Trafficante Sr. was born in Chanchana, near Palermo. At age 18, he emigrated to America, landing in Tampa, Florida, just after the turn of the century. Tampa was Cigar City, the center of America's hand-rolled cigar industry. Ybor City, Tampa's Cuban-Italian immigrant neighborhood, housed hundreds of small cigar factories. Workers rolled tobacco leaves by hand, while Electa read newspapers and novels aloud to pass the time. Trafficante Sr. married and started a family. 4 sons, Frank, Santo Jr., Sam, and Henry. He became a naturalized citizen. He joined civic organizations, the Elks Lodge, the Robin Hood Social Club, the Italian Club, and he started working in organized crime. During Prohibition, Tampa became a smuggling hub. Rum from Cuba, whiskey from the Caribbean, all flowing through Port Tampa Bay into speakeasies across Florida. Trafficante Sr. became heavily involved in bootlegging. He also ran bolita games, a popular illegal lottery among Tampa's immigrant communities. Players bet on numbers drawn from a bag of 100 balls. The profits were enormous. By the late 1920s, The Cuban Connection. 1946, Havana, Cuba. Santo Trafficante Sr. dispatched his 24-year-old son to Cuba. The island was 90 miles off Florida's coast. Tourists flocked there for nightlife, gambling, beaches. The Batista government welcomed foreign investment, especially mob investment. Santo Jr.'s mission? Learn the casino business, make connections, establish the family's presence. For the next 8 years, Santo Jr. operated between Tampa and Havana. He helped run mob-owned casinos. He met Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and other major crime figures invested in Cuba. He formed a friendship with Fulgencio Batista, the military strongman who controlled Cuba through puppet presidents until he seized power directly in 1952. And he learned to speak fluent Spanish, rare for an American mafioso.
August 11th, 1954. Santo Trafficante Sr. died of natural causes. Santo Jr. was 39 years old. He immediately took control of the Tampa family, and he expanded the Cuban operations dramatically. By 1955, Trafficante had moved to Cuba full-time. He maintained the luxurious residence in Havana's Vedado neighborhood. He held resident status, essentially living as a Cuban. He openly operated the Sans Souci Cabaret and the Casino International. Behind the scenes, he had interests in the Hotel Habana Riviera, the Tropicana Club, the Sevilla Biltmore, the Capri Casino, the Comodoro, the Deauville, and the Havana Hilton. Second only to Meyer Lansky, Trafficante controlled more casino operations in Cuba than any other American mobster. The casinos generated millions annually. Tourists poured in from the United States. High rollers gambled at the tables. Entertainment drew crowds. But the casinos were just the visible business. Trafficante also ran narcotics trafficking through Cuba. Cocaine from Colombia, heroin from South America and Asia. Using Cuba's military airports as transfer points, drugs flowed through Havana into the United States. He partnered with Tommy Lucchese's New York family on narcotics networks. He coordinated with the Tampa family's operations in Florida. He built an international drug empire. And he maintained his legitimate cover, the cigar factory owner from Tampa. The Revolution. December 31st, 1958. Batista's regime was collapsing. Fidel Castro's guerrilla army had been fighting since 1956. By late 1958, they controlled much of rural Cuba. Batista's military was losing ground. Corruption had destroyed public support for the government. Meyer Lansky saw the writing on the wall. On New Year's Eve, he contacted his casino partners. Close everything, take all the cash for safekeeping. Some listened. Others, including Trafficante, thought they could ride it out. January 1st, 1959, early morning. Batista fled Cuba on a plane to the Dominican Republic. Castro's rebels entered Havana. Citizens flooded the streets. Revolutionaries smashed casino slot machines and threw them into the gutters. The casinos were symbols of Batista's corrupt regime, foreign exploitation, inequality. At the Capri Hotel, rebels stormed the gaming room. Actor George Raft, who worked as a greeter, jumped onto the gaming tables and pleaded with them not to destroy anything. Trafficante watched from the Sans Souci. Castro hadn't even reached Havana yet. He was still marching from the mountains to the capital in a walkathon, giving interviews along the way. And in every interview, Castro said the same thing: the casinos will close. Trafficante hoped he was posturing. Surely Castro would realize the casinos generated revenue Cuba needed. February 19th, 1959. Castro's government issued a decree allowing some casinos to reopen. The Tropicana, Comodoro, Riviera, Habana Riviera, Capri, Hotel St. John's, and Hotel Nacional. The Deauville, Sevilla Biltmore, Plaza, and Sans Souci remained closed. Trafficante's properties stayed shuttered, possibly because of his close relationship with Batista's brother-in-law. Even the reopened casinos struggled. American tourists stopped coming. News of Castro's revolution had killed the flow of visitors to the island. Trafficante stayed anyway. He thought he could reason with Castro's government the same way he'd reasoned with corrupt cops and judges in Tampa. He was wrong about that too.
The imprisonment.
June 9, 1959 evening. Trafficante relaxed in his Havana apartment. His mind was weighed down by the loss of casino revenue, the direction Cuba was heading. He'd heard a detention order was imminent. Harry Anslinger, head of the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics, had sent the Cuban government a list of major American narcotics figures residing in Cuba. Trafficante's name was on it. Trafficante sent the casino employee to visit Cesar Blanco, Cuba's director of public security. He tried to negotiate, to explain his position, to make a deal. It didn't work. Cuban authorities arrested Trafficante and imprisoned him at the Trascornia detention facility. Other American mobsters faced similar treatment. Castro's government had no interest in accommodating foreign criminals. Trafficante spent weeks in Trascornia. During his imprisonment, he received a notable visitor, Jack Ruby, the Dallas nightclub owner who would later kill Lee Harvey Oswald after President Kennedy's assassination. A British journalist working in Cuba claimed he saw Ruby visit Trafficante frequently, bringing food to the imprisoned mob boss. This detail would fuel conspiracy theories for decades. In July, the Cuban government announced Trafficante would be deported. They made reservations on a national airlines flight from Havana to Tampa on July 15th at 7:45 p.m. Tampa Sheriff Ed Blackburn prepared to receive Trafficante back on American soil. But at the last minute, the Cuban authorities suddenly held up the deportation order on orders from a higher authority. Eventually, Trafficante was released and deported to the United States. He relocated to Miami. His Cuban casino empire was gone. Millions of dollars in investments vanished overnight. The island he'd operated on for over a decade closed to him forever. Castro had nationalized all foreign-owned properties. The casinos, hotels, and nightclubs that generated the war's wealth were now Cuban government property. Trafficante adapted. He expanded gambling operations in Florida. He maintained his narcotics networks through Cuban exiles in Miami. He continued running the Tampa family from his Cigar City base. But Cuba, the golden goose, was gone. The CIA connection. September 1960, Washington, D.C. The CIA had a problem. Fidel Castro. The communist revolutionary had seized the Caribbean island 90 miles from Florida. He'd aligned with the Soviet Union. He threatened American interests throughout Latin America. The CIA wanted Castro dead. Director Allen Dulles passed the assignment to Deputy Director Richard Bissell. Bissell handed it to CIA Security Chief Colonel Sheffield Edwards. They needed professional killers, gangland-style hitmen. And the mob had motivation. Castro had destroyed their Cuban operations. Meyer Lansky allegedly offered $1 million reward for Castro's murder. Ex-FBI agent Robert Maheu, who later worked for Howard Hughes in Las Vegas, became the primary go-between. The CIA told Maheu to approach Johnny Rosselli, a mobster who worked for both the Tampa family and the Chicago outfit. Maheu offered $150,000 to have Castro killed. Rosselli declined payment but agreed to help. He introduced Maheu to two men, Sam Gold and Joe. Sam Gold was Sam Giancana, boss of the Chicago outfit. Joe was Santo Trafficante Jr. The CIA had recruited the mob boss who'd just been expelled from Cuba.
Trafficante worked with the CIA and Cuban exile groups on multiple assassination plots against Castro, poison pills, exploding cigars, Mafia hit teams infiltrating Cuba. None succeeded. Trafficante later testified that he acted out of patriotism, receiving no payment.
but some believe Trafficante continued cooperating with the CIA primarily to avoid prosecution for his criminal activities in the United States. By 1962, Trafficante and his mob partners had become convinced the Cuban Revolution couldn't be reversed by simply killing Castro, but they continued playing along with the CIA plot. It protected them from federal prosecution. The FBI finally sees it. For decades, Santo Trafficante Jr. maintained his cover as a legitimate businessman. He owned cigar factories in Tampa. He listed his occupation on government forms as cigar manufacturer or talent agent for International Amusements Corporation, a company that booked entertainment acts. When law enforcement questioned him, he gave short answers or took the Fifth Amendment. In 1954, Florida convicted him of bribery. The Florida Supreme Court overturned the conviction. In 1957, he was arrested at the Appalachian meeting, the infamous summit where law enforcement caught over 60 mob bosses gathered at a Utica, New York estate. Those charges were dropped. In 1981, at age 66, Trafficante faced his first serious federal charges, a RICO indictment for labor union kickbacks. 16 defendants, a 2-year federal probe into the Laborers International Union Trust Fund. The racketeering charge carried a mandatory 20 years in prison and $25,000 fine if convicted. U.S. Magistrate Sherbert Shapiro asked Trafficante what he did for a living. Trafficante replied, "Nothing," then added, "I take the Fifth Amendment." The case eventually fell apart. Trafficante avoided conviction. March 17, 1987, Trafficante died of natural causes in Houston, Texas, age 72. He'd run the Tampa family for 33 years, from 1954 to 1987. He'd controlled massive narcotics networks. He'd operated casinos in pre-Castro Cuba. He'd worked with the CIA on assassination plots. He'd been arrested multiple times. He never spent a single night in an American prison. The FBI eventually documented everything. Treasury Department reports detailed his narcotics trafficking. Bureau of Narcotics files tracked his drug channels through South America and Cuba. FBI reports documented his casino operations, his mob connections, his Cuban exile networks in Miami. But documentation isn't conviction. Trafficante understood how to insulate himself. He used frontmen. He avoided direct involvement in criminal acts. He maintained legitimate businesses that explained his wealth. He took the Fifth Amendment when questioned. And most importantly, he kept a low profile. While Sam Giancana dated celebrities and drew FBI surveillance everywhere, Trafficante stayed quiet. He lived modestly compared to flashier mobsters. He acted like a boring Tampa businessman. The FBI knew he was guilty. They documented his crimes. They built files spanning decades. They never made it stick.
Why he succeeded. Santo Trafficante Jr. ran one of America's most successful crime families for over 3 decades because he understood 3 principles. First, legitimacy is the best cover. The cigar factories weren't just fronts. They were real businesses, generating real income. That made it nearly impossible to prove his wealth came from crime. Second, low profile beats high profile. Trafficante avoided attention. He didn't seek media coverage. He didn't cultivate a public image. He was boring, and boring doesn't attract FBI resources. Third, patience beats impulsiveness. When Castro took Cuba, Trafficante didn't start a war. He adapted. He moved operations to Florida. He built new networks.
He waited for opportunities. The Cuban casinos generated millions annually. Losing them should have destroyed the Tampa family. Instead, Trafficante survived. He rebuilt. He maintained power for another 28 years after Castro's revolution. Most mob bosses from his era went to prison or got murdered. Vito Genovese died in prison. Carlo Gambino died before prosecution. Sam Giancana was murdered. Paul Castellano was murdered. John Gotti died in prison. Trafficante died a free man, at home, never having served federal time. For years, Santo Trafficante Jr. presented himself as a Tampa cigar manufacturer, a legitimate businessman, an immigrant success story. The FBI knew better. They documented his narcotics trafficking networks. They tracked his Cuban casino empire. They recorded his mob connections from New York to Chicago to Miami. But knowing and proving are different things. Trafficante cigar factories were real. His talent booking agency was legitimate. His business licenses were valid. His tax returns showed legal income from legal sources. The criminal operations, the drug trafficking, the casino skimming, the mob violence happened behind that legitimate facade. And Trafficante was careful enough to keep the two worlds separate. When Castro's revolution destroyed his Cuban operations in 1959, the FBI thought they'd finally corner Trafficante. Without the casinos, where would his wealth come from? But Trafficante adapted. He expanded in Florida. He maintained narcotics networks. He worked with Cuban exiles in Miami. He kept operating. And he kept his cigar factory cover intact. That's what made Santo Trafficante Jr. so effective. Not his violence, not his territory, not his connections. His patience, his discipline, his understanding that in America, looking legitimate is almost as good as being legitimate. The FBI realized he controlled Cuba. They documented his drug empire. They tracked his mob activities for 40 years. But the cigar manufacturer from Tampa died a free man anyway.
July 30th, 1975, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. Jimmy Hoffa stood in the parking lot of the Marcus Red Fox restaurant. 2:15 p.m. He'd been waiting 45 minutes. He walked to a payphone outside the nearby hardware store, called his wife, Josephine. "I've been stood up," he told her. "I'm gonna wait a few more minutes." Hoffa hung up, walked back to his green Pontiac Granville. He was supposed to meet Anthony Tony Provenzano, the New Jersey Teamsters boss who controlled Local 560, the man Hoffa had once mentored, the man who'd become his enemy. Hoffa wanted to make peace. He needed Tony Pro's support to regain the Teamsters presidency he'd lost years earlier. Instead, witnesses saw Hoffa approach a maroon Mercury. "Get inside." The car drove away. Jimmy Hoffa was never seen again. This is the story of Anthony Tony Provenzano, the truck driver who became a Genovese family capo and Teamsters vice president simultaneously. How he built an empire where union power and mob muscle were the same thing. How he controlled billions in pension funds, thousands of workers and politicians across New Jersey. And how, when someone crossed them, they didn't just lose their job, they disappeared. 17 years later, their bodies still hadn't been found. Tony Pro didn't need to raise his voice. One phone call was enough. The truck driver. May 7th, 1917, Lower East Side, Manhattan. Anthony Provenzano was born to Sicilian immigrants Rosario and Josephine Provenzano, fourth of 6 children. They lived in a crowded tenement, struggling through poverty that defined immigrant life in early 20th century New York. At age 15, Tony Pro quit public school 114. He got a job as a helper at H.P. Welch Trucking Company, $10 a week, lifting boxes, loading trucks. 3 years later, he became a driver. The 1930s were the Great Depression. Millions unemployed. Tony Pro had work, barely paying enough to survive, but it was something. He also had talent. As a teenager, he'd been a gifted athlete. He boxed professionally, considered making it a career. But the money wasn't there. Trucking paid more reliably than boxing purses. In 1945, at age 28, Provenzano became shop steward at his trucking company, his first taste of union power. He discovered he was good at it, negotiating, organizing, standing up to management. He also discovered something else. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters was controlled by men who understood that unions weren't just about workers' rights. They were about power, and Tony Pro wanted power. Between 1948 and 1958, Provenzano worked as a business agent for Teamsters Local 560 in Union City, New Jersey. He built relationships with truck drivers, warehouse workers, dock laborers. In 1958, he became president of Local 560. His salary, $100,000 annually, half of it approved in a 1962 vote when 98% of union membership was absent. Nobody questioned it. The ones who did had a way of disappearing. 17 years later, their bodies still hadn't been found. Tony Pro didn't need to raise his voice. One phone call was enough.
The mentor and the protege. 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa was rising through Teamsters leadership. Hoffa understood organized crime's value to the union movement. The mob provided muscle when management refused to negotiate. They broke strikes by rival unions. They ensured Teamsters contracts got signed. In return, the mob gained access to the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, billions of dollars that could be loaned to mob-connected businesses with minimal oversight. It was a marriage of convenience, and Tony Pro was the perfect hybrid. He was both Teamsters president and Genovese family capo. He answered to mob bosses and union leadership simultaneously. When disputes arose, labor or criminal, Tony Pro could resolve them. Hoffa loved them. Tony Pro got things done. When federal labor officials demanded Hoffa remove Provenzano from the Teamsters because of his mob connections, Hoffa simply promoted him. Tony Pro became International Union Vice President, covering East Coast operations. The relationship worked for years. Hoffa protected Tony Pro. Tony Pro delivered New Jersey for Hoffa. Then everything changed. The prison feud. July 1963. Tony Pro was convicted of extortion, sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. He served his time at United States Penitentiary, Lewisburg in Pennsylvania, starting May 1966. Jimmy Hoffa arrived at Lewisburg in 1967, convicted of jury tampering and fraud, sentenced to 13 years. For the first time in their relationship, they were equals, both imprisoned, both stripped of official positions, both relying on subordinates to maintain their power on the outside. The dynamic shifted. According to multiple accounts, they had a physical altercation in prison. Hoffa allegedly made a disrespectful comment. Tony Pro responded violently, reportedly smashing a bottle on Hoffa's head. The friendship was over. In 1970, Tony Pro was released after serving 4.5 years. He returned to New Jersey, where his brother Nunzio had been managing Local 560. Tony Pro resumed control. Jimmy Hoffa remained in prison until December 1971, when President Nixon commuted his sentence. But Nixon's order included a condition.
Hoffa was banned from union activity until 1980. Hoffa couldn't accept that. The Teamsters was his life, his identity, his power base. He began fighting to regain the presidency, and he needed support from Teamsters leaders across the country, including Tony Pro.
The threat. 1973 and 74, Hoffa repeatedly approached Tony Pro for support. Tony Pro refused. Frank Fitzsimmons, Hoffa's successor as Teamsters president, had grown comfortable in the position. He didn't want Hoffa back, and Tony Pro preferred Fitzsimmons. Fitzsimmons looked the other way while mob-connected officials looted pension funds and used union resources for personal gain. Hoffa, for all his corruption, had standards. He drew lines. He occasionally pushed back against mob overreach. Fitzsimmons didn't. According to witness testimony, Hoffa's requests for support became more aggressive. He threatened, promised retaliation, suggested he'd expose Tony Pro's criminal activities if he didn't cooperate. Tony Pro responded with his own threat. "I'll pull out your guts and kidnap your grandchildren." It wasn't an idle threat. Tony Pro's reputation was built on violence against anyone who opposed him. In 1961, Anthony Castellitto, Secretary-Treasurer of Local 560, had tried to challenge Tony Pro's control. He'd maneuvered politically, built support among rank-and-file members. Tony Pro's response was swift. He ordered his underlings to kill Castellitto. They lured Castellitto to a meeting, murdered him, disposed of the body. 17 years later, when Tony Pro was finally prosecuted for that murder in 1978, investigators believed Castellitto's body had been put through a tree shredder. It was never found. That was Tony Pro's method. You didn't just die, you disappeared. Your family never got closure, your body never got buried. It was a message to everyone else. Don't cross Tony Pro. By 1975, at least 2 of Tony Pro's union opponents had been murdered. Others who'd spoken out had been assaulted, homes shot up at night, workers beaten. It was an era when challenging Tony Pro meant risking your life. Jimmy Hoffa knew this, but he was desperate. The meeting that never happened. Summer 1975. Hoffa called for a meeting. He wanted to sit down with Tony Pro, settle their differences. Maybe Hoffa hoped his old protege would remember their friendship. Maybe he thought he could negotiate. Or maybe, as later Senate testimony suggested, Hoffa was planning his own preemptive strike. Philadelphia mob hitman Charlie Allen testified in 1982 that Hoffa planned to have Provenzano killed along with Frank Fitzsimmons and 3 others. Provenzano got tipped off, Allen told the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations. July 30th, 1975. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Marcus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, a Detroit suburb. Hoffa arrived early. He waited in the parking lot, made calls from the payphone. 2:15 p.m., he called his wife. "I've been stood up." Witnesses saw Hoffa approach a maroon Mercury. He appeared to recognize whoever was inside. He got in willingly. The car drove away. Jimmy Hoffa vanished.
The alibis. Within hours, the FBI knew where to look. Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a Detroit mobster with Teamsters connections. The investigation moved quickly. Both men were questioned. Tony Pro's alibi? He was playing cards with Stephen Andretta, a local 560 member and mob associate in Union City, New Jersey that afternoon. Another account said Tony Pro was seen fraternizing with local union members in Hoboken, which borders Union City. Either way, he wasn't in Michigan. Witnesses confirmed it. Records supported it. Tony Jack Jike alone had similar documentation. He wasn't at the restaurant that day. But the FBI didn't believe they'd personally carried out the hit. These were bosses. They ordered murders. They didn't commit them. December 4, 1975, a federal investigator testified in Detroit court that a witness had identified 3 New Jersey men who participated in the abduction and murder of Jimmy Hoffa. All 3 were close associates of Tony Pro: Salvatore Briguglio, his brother Gabriel Briguglio, and Thomas Andretta. December 1975, 400 members of Local 560, at Tony Pro's urging, volunteered to help the FBI search a jump where informant Ralph Picardo claimed Hoffa's body had been buried. Think about that. The prime suspect's own union members offering to help find evidence against their boss. The FBI declined. If Hoffa's body was there, Tony Pro's people would never let him find it. Over the following years, multiple informants came forward. Frank, the Irishman Sheeran, a Teamsters official and mob associate, confessed late in life to being involved in Hoffa's murder. He claimed he'd shot Hoffa in a Detroit house. Other accounts varied. Some said Hoffa was knocked unconscious and buried alive. Others said he was killed in Detroit and brought back to New Jersey so Tony Pro could personally verify the body. One investigator said, "We were told that Hoffa was grabbed, killed there, and brought back to New Jersey for Provenzano to personally verify that he was dead." A former mob associate explained the mentality. The way they kill a guy is a message, and there'd be no better way to claim victory over Jimmy Hoffa than by driving by him every day. A trophy. There he is, that's where he still sits. Tony Pro wanted to see Hoffa dead, wanted to know for certain his enemy was gone, wanted that satisfaction. Jimmy Hoffa's body has never been found. The empire continues. After Hoffa's disappearance, Tony Pro stepped down as president of Local 560. His brother Nunzio took over. Then, when Nunzio couldn't continue, Tony Pro's nephew became secretary-treasurer. The Provenzano family controlled Local 560 for another decade. The pension fund loans continued. The mob's grip on trucking operations remained tight. 10 weeks after Hoffa disappeared, President Richard Nixon made his first public appearance since resigning. He golfed with Frank Fitzsimmons and Tony Pro. The optics was stunning. A former president playing golf with the prime suspect in a union boss's disappearance. But Tony Pro was untouchable, for now. December 9th, 1975, Tony Pro was indicted for conspiracy to violate anti-kickback statutes, a $2.3 million pension fund loan scheme. July 1978, he was convicted, sentenced to 4 years. But the FBI had something bigger: the 1961 murder of Anthony Castellitto. June 23, 1976, Tony Pro was indicted in Ulster County, New York, for conspiracy and murder in Castellitto's death. The case took 2 years to bring to trial. Tony Pro's lawyers fought every motion, delayed everything. But in June 1978, the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, associates who'd flipped, testimony about how Castellitto was lured to his death. June 14, 1978, Tony Pro was convicted of murder. June 21, 1978, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was 61 years old. He'd spent 30 years building a criminal empire through union control, and it ended with a murder committed 17 years earlier. In 1981, Tony Pro faced another RICO indictment, this time for union kickbacks involving the Laborers International Trust Fund. 16 defendants, a mandatory 20 years if convicted. U.S. Magistrate Herbert Shapiro asked Tony Pro what he did for a living. Tony Pro replied, "Nothing." Then, "I take the Fifth Amendment." The case eventually fell apart, but it didn't matter. Tony Pro was already serving life. December 12, 1988, Tony Pro died in prison at age 71. He never admitted involvement in Hoffa's disappearance, never gave up information about where the body was buried, never cooperated. The omerta held even in death.
Why it worked. For 3 decades, Tony Pro operated with near impunity. He murdered union opponents. He extorted trucking companies. He looted pension funds. He made people disappear. And he got away with it until the Castellito prosecution in 1978. Why? Because Tony Pro understood something most mobsters didn't. Union power is more valuable than mob muscle. A made man in the Genovese family could order a hit, but he'd be breaking the law, risking prosecution, creating evidence. A Teamsters vice president could make one phone call, tell a trucking company they'd face a strike if they didn't fire someone, tell warehouse workers to refuse to unload a competitor's goods, tell pension fund managers to deny a loan to a business owner who didn't cooperate. All perfectly legal, all devastating. Tony Pro didn't need to threaten people with violence, though he did. He could destroy them economically, take away their livelihoods, bankrupt their businesses. That's why bosses feared him. Not just because he was a Genovese capo, but because he controlled Local 5, one of the most powerful Teamsters locals in America. When Tony Pro made a phone call, things happened. Trucks stopped running. Workers walked off jobs. Money disappeared from accounts. And if economic pressure wasn't enough, people disappeared too. Jimmy Hoffa learned that the hard way. July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa stood in a parking lot, waiting for Tony Pro. He thought he could negotiate, make peace, regain support for his comeback. He didn't realize Tony Pro had already made the decision. One phone call, one meeting set up by trusted associates, one last car ride. Hoffa's body was never found. Despite decades of investigations, multiple informants, FBI searches across New Jersey and Michigan, nothing. Tony Pro took that secret to his grave in 1988. The FBI believes they know what happened. Witnesses described the plot. Informants gave details. Associates explained the logistics. But without a body, without physical evidence, the case remains officially unsolved. That's what made Tony Pro terrifying. He didn't just kill people, he made them vanish, erased them so completely that 17 years later, when prosecutors finally charged him with Anthony Castellito's murder, they had to proceed without ever recovering the body. One phone call, that's all it took. And Jimmy Hoffa, the most powerful union leader in America, the man who'd built the Teamsters into a national force, the mentor who'd elevated Tony Pro from truck driver to vice president, disappeared forever. Tony Pro never raised his voice. He didn't need to. One phone call was enough.
May 1980, Brooklyn, New York. FBI agents arrested Henry Hill on narcotics charges. They found him at home with his wife Karen, hiding from the mob associates who'd been calling his house all day. The agents showed Hill a surveillance video. His former partners, Jimmy Burke, Paul Vario, the guys he'd worked with for 25 years, discussing how they'd whack him. Hill watched the tape. Then an FBI agent made the offer. Testify against him, we'll protect you. Or refuse, and you'll be dead within a week. Hill didn't hesitate. I knew I was a dead man, no matter how you cut it. If I stayed in prison, I was dead. Went out in the street, I was dead. May 27, 1980. Henry Hill signed an agreement with the Brooklyn Organized Crime Strike Force.
He became an FBI informant. His testimony would lead to 50 convictions. Paul Vario, his mentor since age 13. Jimmy Burke, his closest friend, and dozens of Lucchese family associates. Everyone thought the mob would kill him. They had a $500,000 contract on his head. Professional hitmen looking for him. Associates in every city watching for a glimpse. But Henry Hill died June 12, 2012. Natural causes. Heart disease. Age 69. In a Los Angeles hospital. Not in an alley with 2 bullets in his head. This is the story of Henry Hill, the mob associate who broke every rule of omerta and survived 32 years to tell about it. How he went from Brooklyn street kid to Lucchese family insider. How the Lufthansa heist made him rich and paranoid. And how he became the most famous rat in mob history. Not because of what he did, but because he lived long enough for Hollywood to make him a legend. The Kid from Brownsville. June 11th, 1943. Brownsville, Brooklyn. Henry Hill Jr. was born to Henry Hill Sr., an Irish electrician, and Carmela Costra, a Sicilian immigrant. Mixed heritage, half Irish, half Sicilian, which meant one thing in the mob world. Henry could never be a made man. Full Italian blood was required for formal membership in La Cosa Nostra. But as a kid, Henry didn't know that. He just knew the wise guys across the street looked cooler than anyone else in the neighborhood. Brownsville was mob territory. The Lucchese crime family controlled the area. And across from Henry's apartment building at 3857 Glenmore Avenue sat a cab stand, Pitkin Avenue Cab Company. It wasn't really a cab company. It was a front for Paul Vario's crew. Vario was a Lucchese capo. The cab stand was where his associates guarded, planned hijackings, divided stolen goods, and collected loan shark payments. At age 11, Henry wandered across the street looking for a part-time job. They hired him, running errands, fetching sandwiches, parking cars. At 13, Henry met Jimmy Burke, the hijacker, known as Jimmy the Gent, because he always tipped well. Henry served drinks at a card game. Burke tipped them $20, then another $20. He was sawbucking me to death, Hill later said. Henry was hooked. These guys wore silk suits, drove Cadillacs, had beautiful women. They commanded respect. Nobody messed with them. At 14, Paul Vario's brother Tutty got Henry a union card in the bricklayers local. The job paid well, $90 a week on paper, but Henry only saw $40. The rest went to Vario as tribute. Henry didn't care. He was in, part of the crew. He dropped out of school. When his father found out, he beat him so badly that Tutty Vario went to his house and told the father, "If you ever touch that kid again, you're gonna deal with me." Message received. Henry never went back to school. The hijacker. 1950s and 60s, Henry Hill became a professional criminal, hijacking trucks, burning down competitors' businesses for insurance fraud, loan sharking, bookmaking, extortion. He worked under Jimmy Burke, the most prolific hijacker in New York. They stole everything: cigarette trucks, liquor shipments, electronics, clothing. Burke knew which trucks carried valuable cargo. He knew their routes, when to hit them. Henry was the inside man. He bribed airport workers at Idlewild, later renamed Kennedy Airport, for information about incoming shipments. He found out which trucks were carrying Marlboros, which had Johnny Walker, which had expensive electronics. Then, Burke's crew would hijack the truck, sell the goods to fences, split the profits. They were making $30,000 per month. In 1960s money, that was a fortune. Henry also became a maid associate of the Lucchese family, as close as he could get without being full Italian. On October 31st, 1975, Henry participated in his initiation ceremony alongside several others who were being formally made. He couldn't be a full member, but he was protected, trusted, part of the inner circle. By the 1970s, Henry had everything he wanted: money, respect, a wife, Karen Friedman, who he'd married in 1965, 2 kids, Greg and Gina. He also had a side business: drugs. The Lucchese family officially banned drug trafficking. The punishment for dealing was death. Too much heat from law enforcement, too risky. But Henry and Jimmy Burke couldn't resist. The profits were too good. They started dealing marijuana, then cocaine, then heroin, then quaaludes. They made enormous amounts of money, sometimes $250,000 per week. Paul Vario didn't officially know. Or maybe he knew and looked the other way as long as he got his cut. Either way, Henry was making millions and getting sloppy. The heist. December 11th, 1978, Kennedy Airport. Jimmy Burke orchestrated the Lufthansa heist, stealing $5 million in cash and jewelry from the Lufthansa cargo building. It was the largest cash robbery in American history at that time. $6 million total if you count the jewelry. Henry wasn't directly involved in the actual heist, but he'd provided inside information from airport workers he'd bribed. He knew the cargo was there. He knew the security was weak. After the robbery, Jimmy Burke started killing everyone involved. The standard rule after a big score: lay low, don't attract attention, don't buy flashy things, wait 6 months, then slowly start spending. But the crew ignored that advice. One guy bought his wife a mink coat. Another bought a new Cadillac. A third bought jewelry. Burke panicked. If they kept acting stupid, the FBI would connect them to the heist within weeks. So he started eliminating them, one by one. Stax Edwards, shot dead January 8, 1979. He'd bought a Cadillac and drew attention. Tommy DeSimone, killed January 14, 1979. He'd become a liability, too violent, too unpredictable. Martin Krugman disappeared February 6, 1979. Body never found. He knew too much about the planning. By 1980, Burke had killed or arranged the murders of at least 8 people connected to the heist. Henry realized he was next. He was also getting sloppy with his drug dealing. A young kid who'd been working as a drug mule for Henry got arrested. The kid told detectives about Henry's operation. NYPD detectives Daniel Mann and William Broder started surveillance. They got wiretaps. They listened to thousands of Henry's phone calls. Henry and his crew used coded language. The Pittsburgh connection meant drugs from Pennsylvania. Golf clubs meant kilos. Dogs meant payment. But the detectives understood. They built the case. April 1980. Police arrested Henry on narcotics charges. They raided his house, found drugs, arrested his wife, Karen Toe. Henry knew what was coming. Jimmy Burke had killed everyone else connected to the heist. Henry was the last loose end.
The deal. May 1980. Federal custody. Edward McDonald, head of the Brooklyn Organized Crime Strike Force, made Henry an offer. Testify against your associates. Paul Vario, Jimmy Burke, everyone involved in the drug operation. Everyone involved in crimes we can prove. In exchange, immunity from prosecution, protection for your family, a new life in the Witness Protection Program. If you refuse, face decades in prison for the drug charges and hope the mob doesn't kill you before trial. Henry thought about his mentor, Paul Vario. He'd known the man since age 13. Vario had given him his first job, protected him from his father, taught him the business. He thought about Jimmy Burke, his best friend for 25 years, the guy who'd made him rich. He thought about his wife, Karen, his kids, Greg and Gina, 13 and 11 years old. I was in trouble, Henry later said. I knew I was a dead man no matter how you cut it. If I stayed in prison, I was dead.
Went out in the street, I was dead, so my choice was already made. May 27th, 1980, Henry Hill signed the cooperation agreement. He became a rat, an informant, the worst thing you could be in the mob world. The testimony. Over the next few years, Henry testified in multiple trials. He gave prosecutors everything: names, dates, locations, methods, how Pulverio ran his crew, how Jimmy Burke organized hijackings, how the loan shark operations worked, how they'd bribed cops, judges, airport workers. He testified about murders he'd witnessed, crimes he'd participated in, money he'd helped launder. His testimony led to 50 convictions. Pulverio sentenced to 10 years on gambling charges, more time for extortion. Jimmy Burke sentenced to 12 years for the Boston College point-shaving scandal, then life in prison for murder. Dozens of Lucchese associates went to prison on various charges: racketeering, extortion, drug trafficking. Henry had destroyed the crew he'd worked with for 25 years, and he put a target on his back that would last the rest of his life.
The Witness Protection Program. June 1980. Henry, Karen, Greg, and Gina Hill entered the U.S. Federal Witness Protection Program. The U.S. Marshals gave them new names, new social security numbers, new birth certificates, new identities. They moved to Omaha, Nebraska, land the cornfields, far from New York City, far from anyone who knew them. The government gave them $1,500 per month, a rental house, instructions to never contact anyone from their old life. The only thing the marshals told them: don't tell anyone you're from New York. Greg and Gina had to pack their entire lives into garbage bags, leave their friends, leave their school, leave everything. Up until that time, all my father's exploits really only affected him, Greg later said. This was the first time we started feeling the impact of what he was doing. And to be told we were leaving forever, it was a hard fact to sink in. But Henry couldn't stay quiet. He called drug-dealing friends in New York. He called his girlfriends. He went to bars and told people he was from Brooklyn. The information got back to Jimmy Burke. The $500,000 contract on Henry's head was still active. The Marshals moved the family again. Independence, Kentucky. Henry got drunk and drove recklessly, got arrested, drew attention. They moved again. Redmond, Washington. Same problems. Henry kept getting arrested for drunk driving. He fought with his son Greg. Finally, at age 19, Greg couldn't take it anymore. One of the most painful things I ever did was leave my mother and my sister, Greg said. But I knew if I stayed there, something terrible would have happened. Greg left, never came back. Henry didn't shed a tear. By 1987, Henry and Karen had been kicked out of the Witness Protection Program. Henry kept getting arrested, kept blowing his cover, kept committing crimes. Drug possession, drunk driving, parole violations. The Marshals gave up. If Henry wanted to get killed, that was his choice. The aftermath. 1985, Nicholas Pileggi published Wise Guy, Life in a Mob Family, based on extensive interviews with Henry. The book became a bestseller. Everyone wanted to know about the inside of the mob. 1990, Martin Scorsese adapted the book into Goodfellas. Ray Liotta played Henry. Robert De Niro played Jimmy Burke, renamed Jimmy Conway in the film. Joe Pesci played Tommy DeVito, renamed Tommy DeVito in the film. The film was a massive critical and commercial success. 6 Oscar nominations. Joe Pesci won for Best Supporting Actor. Henry made $550,000 from the film. He claimed he was still owed millions more. But money wasn't Henry's problem. His problem was staying alive. After leaving witness protection,
Henry moved to California with his girlfriend Lisa Casetta. He lived openly, used his real name, made public appearances. He went on the Howard Stern show repeatedly, often drunk, slurring his words. Stern's listeners threatened to kill him on air. Henry kept calling back. He appeared on 60 Minutes, AMC's Mob Week, Locked Up Abroad. He wrote books, did speaking tours. Everyone expected the mob to kill him. $500,000 contract, 50 convictions from his testimony, the ultimate rat. But decades passed. Paul Vario died in 1988. Jimmy Burke died in 1996. Most of the people Henry testified against died in prison or of old age. And Henry kept living, drinking, smoking, getting arrested for drunk driving and bar fights. June 12, 2012, Henry Hill died at age 69 in a Los Angeles hospital. Heart disease, complications from decades of smoking, and a recent heart attack. His girlfriend, Lisa Casetta, said he went out pretty peacefully for a good fella.
Why he survived. Henry Hill survived 32 years as the most famous rat in mob history. How? First, time. Most of the people who wanted him dead eventually died themselves. Paul Vario, Jimmy Burke, the Lucchese family members he testified against. After 20 years, the contract on his head became less urgent. The new generation didn't care as much. Second, visibility. Paradoxically, Henry's public profile protected him. After Goodfellas came out, everyone knew who he was. Killing him would draw massive media attention. The FBI would investigate intensely. Better to let him live and fade into irrelevance. Third, geography. Henry stayed away from New York. He lived in California. When he did travel, he moved quickly, never stayed in one place too long. Fourth, the mob was weakening. The 1980s and 90s were devastating for La Cosa Nostra. RICO prosecutions, dozens of informants, FBI surveillance everywhere. The families had bigger problems than one old informant in California. And fifth, Henry had nothing left to give. He'd already testified. The damage was done. Killing him wouldn't undo the convictions. It would just create more problems. So, they let him live. And Henry took full advantage. He milked his story for everything it was worth. Books, movies, TV appearances, speaking fees. Henry Hill broke the ultimate rule of organized crime. Never cooperate with law enforcement. His testimony put 50 mobsters in prison. He destroyed Paul Vario's crew. He helped convict Jimmy Burke, his closest friend for 25 years. In the mob's code, that meant death. A contract on his head. Professional killers hunting him. Associates watching for any sign of him. But Henry Hill died in a Los Angeles hospital at age 69. Not in an alley, not in a car trunk, not with bullets in his head. He outlived Paul Vario. He outlived Jimmy Burke. He outlived most of the Lucchese family members who wanted him dead. And he became more famous than any of them because Martin Scorsese turned his life into Goodfellas, one of the greatest mob films ever made. Henry's survival wasn't because of witness protection. He got kicked out in 1987. Wasn't because of careful planning. He was reckless, drunk, constantly blowing his cover. He survived because time passed, because the mob had bigger problems, because after Goodfellas, killing Henry Hill would have been terrible publicity, and because Henry understood something important. Once you're famous, you're worth alive than dead. The mob could kill him, but that wouldn't undo his testimony, wouldn't erase the book, wouldn't erase the movie. Better to let him live. Let him drink himself to death. Let him become a pathetic cautionary tale. The rat who sold out his friends for 30 pieces of silver. Henry Hill died peacefully. For a rat, that's the ultimate victory. He testified against 50 mobsters and lived to tell about it.